Hi, this is Rev Bev, and we're going to talk about flourishing in our faith, one Bible verse at a time. And today's topics are going to be pornography use, pleasure, specifically self-pleasure, and virginity. And believe it or not, those are all related. The virginity part is specifically who owns your body. Okay? This is where the Bible has been written in a pre-modern patriarchal society, and that's problematic when we talk about these topics. So if we try to slip ourselves back into that culture, we're going to have some problems, right? Because this is a postmodern world, and democracy is an egalitarian force for impacting our relationships in good ways, one would hope, anyway. So let's talk about a pre-modern world is a time when the world is flat and the sun and the moon and the stars all revolve around the earth. And it's when sin conditions such as psoriasis are called leprosy. It's when God is definitely a male. It is when only male babies count. And also, it is when women are subservient to the male, who may or may not value her or love her. That's not the whole idea behind marriage. And for her, the only function is to make male babies. So, in a patriarchal world, women can be discarded or traded as collateral, as Abraham did with Sarah at least 2 times to save his own skin. He offered her. It is a time when marriage comes after the contractual agreement of purchase that has been negotiated with the woman's father or her brothers, right? So in biblical times, the marriage happened at the time of betrothal. The betrothal was the contract agreement that the men had all decided upon. There would be a celebration of some kind, of course, and she would belong to him. Now, there was no trotting down to the courthouse to get the legal piece of paper written by the judge that make the whole thing legal in that society. It's interesting to contrast an agrarian society of that era versus now, or even with hunting and gathering. So anthropologists and sociologists would tell us that in hunting and gathering societies, the women played a chief role in food gathering and farming because that's where most of their food would come from. But when they began to farm in agrarian societies, as opposed to the hunting and gathering, then what happened was they began to value the inheritance of the property once the father was gone. And land became very important to determine men's wealth and men's status. So, in that kind of a situation, you have to know if you're going to pass your land on who the daddy is. And to know who the daddy is, you have to control the women. So, by protecting your wife, you're protecting your property and any male heirs that she should be fortunate enough to produce. So, our discussion about virginity in our times reflects some of these ideas, like whose property is your body. In evangelical Christian circles, the woman belongs to her husband. Still, the saying goes that she gives her body to him on the wedding night, just as surely as in more traditional societies, perhaps in the Mideast, that value proof of a woman's virginity so that it maintains the man's honor and he hasn't been cheated from by being given used merchandise. Right? Some of that language comes up in the church as well, and that's simply based on the old way of being society that we are now an egalitarian society in the U.S., at least for the time being. Now, some men want to return to those days of ownership of women, unfortunately. But let's be clear, to have a flourishing faith in these sexual bodies, nobody can flourish when somebody else owns your body or has control of it, or if you give it away to someone else. There's no flourishing when there are power principles operating of domination and submission. getting acted out in the bedroom because of marriage. I'm not talking about here negotiated power plays. That's something totally different. No one flourishes when they do not have control of their own body. And no one is going to have a wild and crazy sex life when the partnership is based on inequality. Flourishing requires trust and consent. Ownership is not conducive to either of those. It's not about trust, it's about obedience, right? It's not about consent, it's about obedience to what somebody else says we have to do or be. So, if there's no good stuff happening in the bedroom, then it might be well to look at the power dynamics that are operating in the bedroom between the couple, partners in the couples, or in the minds of the partners. And when you're obeying rules, you're not listening to what your needs are, what your interests are, what are your preferences, what your fantasies are telling you. You're busy obeying the way you think you should be behaving. That comes right out of a pre-modern understanding of a patriarchal understanding of society. So, flourishing in ownership, is that even possible? Nah. If you have given your body to your husband, you no longer have control. Guess what? He does. You gave it to him. Well, God bless your soul. But if that happens, you have now volunteered to be a slave. By definition. Now, would we make an argument that slaves, given a choice, they would choose to remain enslaved because they had some great allegiance to their owner? I hope we're not so delusional as to believe that, although in the past there have been those who've tried it. But yet there is something about the way Christians sometimes paint an ideal marriage relationship, a Christian marriage, that does just that. Your body is your own. You do not belong to one another. God didn't say it at all. You belong to God. We belong to God, not to a partner. We have not been given a body just to give it away to the highest bidder. Got that? Everybody is a gift, and each one of us is in charge of taking care of that gift. And as we consider getting out from under repressive Christian teachings about sexuality and the body, and we want to follow Jesus toward an abundant life, we must rethink this kind of language about virginity and the hierarchy of domination and submission. So, on the wedding night, if the focus has been to remain virginal, the so-called gift you give one another is your sexual ignorance. And nobody's having fun when that happens. If we know nothing about our bodies, desires, or wishes, or fantasies, if we do not know the contours of our own body, then we are clueless as to how to move into an erotic place of pleasure with a partner. Right? So that brings us to a second topic of self-pleasure. Do we have the right to pleasure ourselves? Now, for those outside the church, it's like, duh, yeah, why wouldn't I? But for those inside the church who've been taught these other things about gendered hierarchies and so forth, do the women have the right to know their own bodies? The answer is no. That's part of what you give him, right? Unused merchandise idea. Now, because male genitals are easily accessible, men tend to know their bodies. So women entering a relationship knowing her own body is the gift, right? But if the focus is on virginity and keeping her pure, the answer is no. She must remain ignorant. And so what happens for the male? Well, this, I'm talking heterosexuals here. This puts the male in the position of having to be the teacher who has to know not only his own body's responses, but the female biology and her responses. And how is he going to know that if she doesn't know that, right? And how is he going to learn if she can't tell him what's going on? So in that situation, this reinforces his dominant role, whether he wants to be her sex educator or not, right? He has power over her to make something happen. So he feels a weight of responsibility. She feels like he should be making something happen. After all, it's all his responsibility. Can you get the mess that happens on the wedding night? And believe me, this is common in evangelical circles. I hear it from sex therapists and counselors all the time. Conclusion: there is no reason that people should not take responsibility for their own body as gift from God. There is no reason why we cannot create our own pleasure in our own body, with or without a partner. So this moves us to topic number 3, which is pornography use. So fantasies come from our imagination, and it is true that many Christians have a real conflict about imagination because they assume that there's nothing but evil things going on in our imagination, which of course is not true. The Creator gave us our imaginations, and guess what? Inventors use their imaginations to come up with wonderful medical products and pharmacies and all kinds of wonderful things for our society. Poets use their imagination to discover wonderful poems that have never been written. Storytellers use their imagination to spin yarns for our entertainment. Problem solving for societal problems comes from having an imagination and thinking outside the box. All right. So pornography is about fantasies, not sex education. It's about fantasies. I like to use the word erotica as opposed to pornography. Erotica for me means that it is about the fantasy that leads to pleasure, mutual pleasure. That then there's no stereotyping, there's no abuse, there's no violence. It's good stuff, all right? I tend to use the word pornography as an umbrella to talk about all of that, which is about getting off as opposed to getting it on. That's another topic for another day. But pornography then would use those gendered stereotypes or racial stereotypes and the imbalances of power and so forth. So pornography, as in terms of it being a fantasy or erotica, being a fantasy, is helpful to move us into an erotic mood, right? That doesn't always happen spontaneously once you're into a relationship where there are regular patterns involved. Erotica can enliven our ability to create our own new fantasies we never thought of before, or not. It's not for everybody, and that's okay. But just as partners do not own or control each other's bodies, so neither do we control or own what someone else enjoys and finds delight in and is wonderful for their fantasy life. So, erotica use needs to be negotiated with your partner. Arguments about porn usage are way too common, and therapists tell us that it is seldom about pornography. It's usually about something in the relationship. This so-called addiction to porn is usually about a relationship issue. And that requires a counselor and a sex therapist to help you pull out what's really going on here. That's not really about the use of pornography or erotica. And those professionals can help you learn to negotiate and to talk about it without playing the power games or relying on the gender games. All right. So, to put on my pastor's hat, to talk about flourishing, note my interest in personal autonomy, that each one of us makes our own moral choices, and we stand in the judgment seat with our God by ourselves. We're not going to drag in a partner or a spouse to justify the decisions we've made. So, without relying on gender equality or domination and obedience patterns or rules, religious rules. No. Morally autonomous. Note that we can flourish if we have sexual freedom. And I have my pastor's hat on here. We are free to abide by the rules or not abide by the rules, the law, right, in that situation. It's about loving ourselves in this situation particularly, and also loving one another. It is not about following cultural rules of a pre-modern era, or it is not about making the men as the grand poobah over women, either in the household or in the society. That's leftover stuff from a pre-modern world and a patriarchal society that we are not in this culture now. So note that my language has been about heterosexuals. My instincts tell me that same-gendered relationships have approached power issues differently, and that the gendered expectations or gender roles are played out differently. However, if what I'm saying about moral autonomy and flourishing is not sufficient, then I encourage you to go to some writings of gay theologians or gay pastors who can help you work out what the relationship issue is if erotica use or pornography use is a problem for you. So, to get to flourishing, my friend, we have sexual freedom. We have sexual freedom that allows us to have self-pleasure. And self-pleasure requires that we remove ourselves from imposed gender roles that the idea about virginity actually enforces. We were given marvelously created bodies to take care of. We are in charge of our own bodies to care for and enjoy. And when we are attentive to our sexual needs, our spirits will rise in joy, whether we're in a relationship or not. And when we live in joy and take pleasure in a sensual world, and sometimes a sexual world, we will say that yes, this is the abundant life that Jesus promised. We are free from other people's rules about how to find our own spiritual path. And it will always lead to flourishing. Go in peace, my friend, and have a great day.